Idika returns to her ancestral haveli in Jodhpur, seeking to quiet the academic noise of her life against the cool, blue-washed walls. Surrounded by family and the slow rhythm of the desert, she discovers that scientific precision cannot capture the soul of the garden or the depth of her lineage. Listen as she learns to trade her urgency for the art of slow living and the warmth of shared traditions. The cool touch of stone. The heavy iron key groaned in the lock, a sound that felt too loud for the stillness of the courtyard. Idika stepped across the threshold of the haveli, the transition from the blinding Jodhpur sun to the shaded interior hitting her like a physical weight. Even here, in the sudden drop of temperature, the phantom ringing of her telephone persisted. In her mind, she could still see the flicker of the fluorescent lights in the university lab, the relentless scroll of unread emails, and the sterile, white noise hum of the centrifuge that had become the soundtrack of her last 3 years. She carried the frantic pace of the city in her shoulders, her spine curved as if she were still leaning over a microscope, bracing for a deadline that no longer existed. She dragged her suitcase across the polished stone floor, the wheels screeching with a jarring, metal-sharp frequency that echoed up into the high rafters. The sound bounced off the blue-washed walls, returning to her as a reminder of how out of place she felt. Idika stopped in the center of the hallway, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She studied her luggage, a structured, hard-shell case designed for efficiency and transit, and felt a sudden, irrational urge to arrange her belongings with the same taxonomic precision she used for her seed collections. She began to unpack, moving with a mechanical speed, snapping open zippers and folding clothes into tight, right-angled squares, trying to impose a system of order onto the vast, echoing silence of the house. But the silence of the haveli was not a void, it was a presence. It pushed back against her. Every time she reached for a garment or shifted a bag, the air seemed to thicken, slowing her movements until the efficiency she craved felt like a frantic dance. She found herself pacing the length of the corridor, her heels clicking a rapid, erratic rhythm. Her mind was a checklist of things she should be doing, checking the humidity of the soil in the courtyard, drafting a preliminary list of the rainy season blooms, verifying the pH of the local groundwater. She was calculating the trajectory of her stay as if it were a research project, her internal clock still ticking at the speed of a tenure-track professor's expectations. She stopped abruptly. The air in the hallway felt too thin, the ceiling too high, and the ghost of 1,000 urgent notifications seemed to vibrate in the marrow of her bones. Without thinking, Idika turned and pressed her palms flat against the blue-washed stone wall. The chill was immediate. It wasn't the artificial cold of an air conditioner, but a deep, mineral cold that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. The stone was slightly uneven, the lime wash giving it a matte, chalky texture that gripped her skin. Idika let out a long, shuddering exhale, her forehead leaning forward to touch the surface. The temperature difference between her flushed skin and the ancient stone acted as a physical break, a sudden grounding wire for the electrical storm in her head. She closed her eyes, focusing entirely on the sensation of the cold seeping into her palms, forcing her heart rate to decelerate until it matched the slow, heavy pulse of the house. She stayed there for a long time, the silence shifting from something oppressive to something protective. In the darkness of her closed lids, the image of the lab began to fade, replaced by the scent of old dust and dried night bloom scent. As she shifted her weight, her gaze drifted upward. Pinned to a darkened wooden beam, just above eye level, was a small, yellowed scrap of parchment. It was a botanical sketch, a simple drawing of a desert shrub, perhaps a caligonum, its branches twisting in a way that defied the rigid rules of symmetry. Idika stepped closer, her fingertips grazing the paper. The lines were soft, imprecise, and lacked the technical rigor of her own illustrations. There were no scale bars, no Latin labels in precise calligraphy, and no cross-sections of the seed pods. It was a sketch made for the sake of seeing, not for the sake of documenting. It was her grandmother's hand, a hand that didn't care for the science of the plant, but for the spirit of its growth. Idika felt a strange tightness in her throat. For years, she had viewed her grandmother's knowledge as an intuitive curiosity, something to be refined and categorized by academic study. Looking at the sketch, she realized the drawing wasn't imprecise, it was honest. It captured the lean of the plant against a wind that only the artist could feel. She spent the next hour simply leaning against the stone, her back against the blue wall, watching the way the light shifted across the floor. The haveli didn't ask her for a syllabus. It didn't demand a peer-reviewed summary of her progress. It simply existed, a heavy, cooling sanctuary that demanded nothing but her presence. The restlessness that had driven her across continents began to settle, sinking into the floor like sediment in a glass of water. She felt the tension leave her jaw, her shoulders finally dropping away from her ears. Driven by a quiet, newfound curiosity, Idika began to wander. She climbed the narrow stairs to the upper gallery, where the air grew thinner and the scent of cedar more pronounced. The gallery was a long, shadowed stretch of carved wood and arched openings that looked out over the city's azure rooftops. At the far end of the hall, tucked into a recessed alcove, sat a heavy wooden chest. It was crafted from dark shisham wood, its surface scarred with deep gouges and polished by decades of touch. She knelt beside the chest, the wood cool beneath her knees. A small brass lock held the lid shut, the metal tarnished to a dull brown. Idika reached for the keyhole, her fingers searching for a key that she assumed would be nearby. She searched the surrounding shelves and the dust-covered side tables, but found nothing. She tried the handle, but the lock was firm, unyielding. Inside the chest, she could see the edges of leather-bound journals and bundles of pressed papers, the sensory legacy of a woman who had observed the desert with a different kind of precision. Idika sat back on her heels, staring at the locked chest. The frustration she expected to feel, the urgency to uncover the secrets and organize them, didn't come. Instead, she felt a strange, lingering sense of anticipation. The missing key was not a problem to be solved with a tool or a technician. It was a silence. As she looked back at the blue walls of the gallery, Idika realized that for the first time in years she was perfectly content to wait. That art of waiting. The magnifying glass felt heavy in Idika's hand, a familiar weight that usually promised the clarity of a lab, but here in the courtyard it only served to shrink her world to a few square inches of dusty gray bark. She was mid-stride, her boots crunching on the grit, when she stopped abruptly before a cluster of Tacoma stands. The buds were tight, stubborn nodules of green and gold, locked in a dormant state that defied the arrival of the humidity. Idika leaned in, her breath fogging the lens, cataloging the precise angle of the sepals. She noted the lack of turgor pressure in her sketchbook with a clinical precision, her handwriting small and cramped, the script of someone used to fitting a lifetime of data into the margins of a notebook. She couldn't accept the silence of the plant. To Idika, dormancy wasn't a state of being, it was a problem to be solved, a chemical equation missing a catalyst. She retreated to the edge of the courtyard, where her supplies sat, a row of graduated cylinders and a custom hydration formula she had mixed from a concentrated nutrient solution. She knelt in the dirt, the fabric of her trousers staining a dull ochre, and carefully applied the solution to a targeted patch of soil around the base of the shrub. She watched the liquid, a pale amber hue, hit the parched earth. It didn't soak in so much as it vanished, swallowed instantly by the thirsty soil with a faint, thirsty hiss. There was no bead of moisture on the surface, no lingering dampness. The desert simply erased the intervention. Idika sat back on her heels, waiting. She expected a reaction. A subtle swelling of the stem, a shift in the hue of the leaves, some measurable response to the sudden influx of nutrients. But the shrub remained as still as the blue walls surrounding it. The heat began to thicken, pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. The academic urgency that had sustained her through 3 PhD programs flared in her chest, a sharp, itching need for a result. She wanted a graph, a timeline, a visible trajectory of growth. The desert's indifference felt personal, a wall of silence that her science couldn't scale. It isn't a laboratory, Idika. It doesn't take orders. She looked up to see Amkar Singh leaning against the far wall, his frame almost blending into the azure paint. He kept his hands deep in his pockets, his posture a study in gravitational ease. His voice was a deep, rough murmur, sounding like river stones grinding together under a slow current. He didn't move toward her, nor did he offer a correction. He simply observed her with a quiet, steady gaze. "It's a matter of osmotic potential," Idika replied, her voice melodic but clipped, the cadence of a lecture hall. "The soil is too hydrophobic. If I can just break the surface tension and deliver the nutrients directly to the root zone, the bloom should trigger. It's basic physiology." Omkar let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, a soft, nasal exhale. He shifted his weight slightly, his shoulder rubbing against the rough stone of the wall. "The plant knows the rain," he said. "It isn't waiting for a formula. It is waiting for the sky to break. You are trying to tell the flower how to be a flower." Idika didn't answer. Instead, she spent the next 4 hours in a state of obsessive observation. She set up her easel in the center of the courtyard, sketching the same single bud 12 times. She tracked the light as it shifted from the harsh, vertical white of noon to the long, honeyed gold of the late afternoon. She searched for a tell, a microscopic tremor in the leaf, a change in the translucency of the bud's skin. Anything that would signal the exact moment the internal clock shifted from sleep to wakefulness. She drew the veins of the leaves with surgical accuracy, her pencil scratching rhythmically against the heavy paper, trying to find the science of anticipation. As the sun dipped, casting long indigo shadows across the tiles, the heat became a physical weight. Idika retreated to the deep shade of the veranda, her forehead damp, her fingers stained with graphite. She slumped into a low wooden chair, her breath coming in slow, heavy cycles. Beside her, on a flat piece of volcanic rock, a small lizard sat perfectly motionless. Its throat pulsed in a slow, rhythmic beat, but otherwise it was a statue of scaled gray and brown. It didn't seek shade, it didn't hunt, it simply existed in the stillness, its gold-rimmed eye staring at nothing in particular. Idika watched the creature, and for the first time she felt the absurdity of her magnifying glass. She had spent the day treating the garden as a puzzle to be decoded, a series of locks to be picked. She had approached the haveli as if it were a specimen under a slide, forgetting that she was not the observer, but a part of the environment. Her precision, the very tool that had earned her accolades in London and Boston, was acting as a filter, stripping away the experience of the place in favor of an analysis of it. She realized that by trying to force the desert to follow her timeline, she had effectively locked herself out of the present. She stood up slowly, her joints stiff, and walked back toward the shrub. The air had cooled, carrying the faint, metal-sharp scent of distant rain and the musk of damp stone. She ignored the nutrient cylinders and the sketchbook, stepping instead toward a branch that looked entirely dead. It was a brittle gray limb that slanted sharply toward the ground, devoid of leaves and seemingly hollow. At the very tip, however, clung a single, stubborn bud. It was small, shriveled, and looked more like a dried seed than a promise of a flower. Idika didn't reach for the magnifying glass. She reached out with her bare hand, her fingertips trembling slightly from the day's exhaustion. As her skin brushed the rough exterior of the bud, she didn't feel the coldness of dead wood. Instead, she felt a faint, rhythmic vibration, a hum so subtle it was almost imagined, like the purr of a distant engine or the heartbeat of a bird trapped in a cage. It was a pulse of life so slow it defied the frantic pace of her own mind, a deep, subterranean patience that had been humming along for years. She closed her eyes, tilting her head to listen to the wind whistling through the carved jolly screens of the upper gallery. The vibration in the stem seemed to sync with the rhythm of the house, a slow, ancestral breathing. She let her hand linger there, not trying to measure the frequency or categorize the sensation, but simply feeling the current of something ancient and unhurried. She felt the tension in her jaw finally dissolve, her shoulders dropping an inch lower. "You've stopped fighting it," a voice whispered. Idika turned to see Lopa Jodhpuria standing in the archway, her presence as light and wispy as the cotton sari she wore. She held a small clay cup of tea, the steam curling around her face in delicate ribbons. Lopa didn't smile. She simply watched Idika with a look of serene recognition, her eyes reflecting the deepening blue of the evening sky. She took a slow sip of her tea, her movements rhythmic and deliberate, as if she were dancing to a music only she could hear. "I thought I could make it happen faster," Idika admitted, her voice soft, the precise articulation replaced by a weary honesty. Lopa stepped closer, the scent of dried night bloom scent in old paper following her. She studied the shriveled bud and then back at Idika, her expression unreadable yet warm. She didn't offer a lecture on botany or a lesson in patience. Instead, she leaned in, her voice a lullaby that seemed to vibrate in the same frequency as the plant. "The most beautiful things in this desert are the ones that refuse to be rushed." The language of soil. Omkar was halfway buried in the earth, his forearms submerged in a patch of sandy loam near the courtyard's western edge. He didn't use a trowel or a fork, he used his fingers, digging with a slow, rhythmic precision that looked less like gardening and more like a massage. He moved the soil in small, deliberate arcs, turning the earth over as if he were unfolding a piece of ancient silk. Idika stood a few feet away, the hem of her cotton tunic catching on a stray piece of gravel. She watched the way he ignored the surrounding chaos of the garden, focusing entirely on a 6-inch radius of dirt. "The nitrogen levels in this quadrant seem low," Idika said, her voice cutting through the heavy stillness of the afternoon. "If we supplement with a slow-release organic fertilizer, we could probably stabilize the pH and encourage the root systems to deepen before the monsoon hits. I have some samples in my kit that could actually map the mineral deficiency if we wanted to be precise." Omkar didn't move. He didn't even blink. He remained crouched, his hands still deep in the grit, his gaze fixed on a pale thread of a root. The silence that followed wasn't a silence for thought. It was a wall. Idika waited, her fingers twitching toward the pocket where she kept her notebook. She felt the urge to fill the void with data, to categorize the silence as a lack of comprehension or a sign of fatigue. But as the seconds stretched into a full minute, the silence began to change. It stopped being a void and started becoming a presence. Forced into stillness, Idika stopped calculating. She tilted her head, listening. The wind was whistling through the carved jolly screens of the upper gallery, a hollow, fluting sound that mirrored the shape of the stone. A distant crow called from the roof of the haveli, a sharp, lonely sound that echoed against the blue-washed walls. She noticed the way the light hit the dust motes dancing between the arches, turning the air into a thick, golden suspension. The frantic internal clock she had carried from the university, the one that measured life in semesters and publication deadlines, seemed to stutter and slow, syncing with the heavy, humid pulse of the courtyard. "The earth isn't missing anything," Omkar finally said. His voice was a deep, rough rasp, like the sound of shifting pebbles at the bottom of a dry creek. He didn't look up. "It isn't a ledger to be balanced, Idika. It isn't a hungry mouth that needs a pill to be satisfied." Idika frowned, her scientific instinct bristling. "But the chemistry is objective. If the soil lacks phosphorus, the plant cannot synthesize energy. That isn't a philosophy, it's a biological fact." Omkar slowly withdrew his hands from the dirt. He sat back on his heels, his palms coated in a thick, grayish-brown paste. He studied her then, his eyes clouded, but steady. "The soil isn't missing nutrients. It is waiting for a signal. The desert doesn't want to be fed by a bottle. It wants to be woken up by the sky. If you force it to grow now, you are only teaching it to be weak. You are giving it a meal when it should be dreaming of the rain." He extended a hand, gesturing for her to come closer. Idika hesitated, then stepped forward, the heat of the stones radiating through the soles of her sandals. "Close your eyes," he commanded softly. She obeyed, the sudden darkness making the scent of damp stone and old nightbloom scent more acute. Omkar took her hand and pressed her palm flat against the soil. He didn't just place her hand on the surface. He pushed her fingers slightly into the grit, forcing her to feel the texture of the earth. "Don't think about the pH," he whispered. "Don't think about the minerals. Just feel where it clings. Feel where it pulls away. The moisture isn't a percentage on a meter. It's a tension. The soil tells you it's thirst by how it holds onto your skin." Idika pressed harder. She felt the grit scraping against her skin, the unexpected coolness of the deeper layer, and the way the dampness felt like a faint, sticky magnetism. In her textbooks, soil was a medium, a substrate for the plant to exist within. It was described in terms of porosity, aeration, and cation exchange capacity. None of the diagrams had mentioned the soul of the earth or the way a particular patch of ground could feel desperate. For the first time, the dirt didn't feel like a chemical composition. It felt like a living thing, breathing in a frequency so slow it was almost geological. She pulled her hand back, looking at the streaks of mud across her palm. She felt a strange, prickling sensation in her throat, a sudden realization of how much she had spent her life observing the world through a lens, never actually touching it. The distance between the scientist and the gardener didn't vanish, but it narrowed, becoming a bridge she was finally willing to cross. They sat together in the dirt for an hour. They didn't speak, and for once, Idika didn't feel the need to fill the air with a hypothesis. They simply existed in the shared quiet, two people anchored to the same piece of ancestral land. Omkar leaned slightly against the blue wall, his eyes half closed, while Idika watched the way the shadows of the jolly screens crawled across the courtyard like slow, black insects. The tension in her shoulders, which had been a permanent fixture since she left the lab, finally began to ebb. As the sun dipped lower, casting long violet shadows across the stones, Omkar shifted his weight and pointed toward the far corner of the garden, where a cluster of ancient, stunted shrubs huddled together. "That section," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It's screaming. Can you hear it? The thirst there is different. It's not the patient wait of the rest of the garden. It's a panic." Idika followed his gaze. To her eyes, the shrubs looked typical for the region, gray-green and hardy. But as she moved closer, her eyes caught something that made her heart skip a beat. She knelt beside the central tree, a gnarled specimen that had likely seen 3 generations of her family. She reached down to clear away a layer of loose pebbles from the base of the trunk, and as the roots were exposed, she froze. The roots weren't the healthy, pale brown she expected. Instead, they were marbled with a strange, unnatural discoloration. Deep, bruised purple veins that spiraled around the bark like frozen lightning. It wasn't a rot she recognized from any pathology textbook, nor was it a common fungus. It looked like a stain, as if the earth itself had bled into the wood. Idika reached out to touch the discoloration, but a sudden, sharp gust of wind whipped through the courtyard, slamming a heavy wooden shutter upstairs with a crash that sounded like a gunshot. She jumped, her hand hovering just inches from the bruised root, the silence of the garden suddenly feeling fragile and deceptive. The rhythm of the dupatta. The brass lamp shifted 2 inches to the left, then 2 inches back, its base scraping against the mahogany surface with a shrill, metal-sharp shriek. Mira was moving in a blur of cotton and desperation, her hands fluttering across the dining table like trapped birds. She smoothed the heavy linen cloth with a violence that suggested she was trying to iron out the very air of the room. Every few seconds, she paused, her eyes darting to the corners of the hall as if searching for a flaw in the architecture itself, before returning to the lamp with a frantic, renewed focus. Idika stood in the doorway, her fingers still stained, a faint, bruised purple from the roots in the courtyard. She didn't speak immediately. She watched the rhythm of Mira's movements, the way her shoulders were hiked up toward her ears, the way she kept catching the edge of her dupatta and pulling it taut across her chest. It was a choreography of anxiety, a loop of correction and dissatisfaction that felt almost rhythmic. The room smelled of beeswax and old cedar, but beneath that was the sharp, static crackle scent of a storm that refused to break, hanging heavy over the haveli. "The symmetry is off," Mira murmured, though she wasn't looking at Idika. Her voice was breathy, a rushed stream of consciousness that barely paused for air. "The lamps have to be equidistant from the center of the table, or the whole room feels tilted. And the napkins, I think the fold is too loose. If they slump, the table looks tired. We can't have a tired table for the reunion. It would be an insult to the memory of the house, wouldn't it?" The sentence ended in that characteristic low hum, a sonic blanket Mira tried to wrap around her nerves to keep them from fraying entirely. Mira reached for a crystal vase of marigolds, her fingers trembling just enough to make the water ripple. She adjusted the vase for the 5th time in 3 minutes, her breath coming in short, shallow sips. Idika noted the way Mira's knuckles were white, the skin stretched tight over the bone. In the lab, Idika had seen this kind of kinetic energy in students before a thesis defense, the need to control the physical environment when the internal one was collapsing. Instead of offering a checklist or suggesting a measuring tape to solve the symmetry problem, Idika stepped into the room. She didn't move toward the table. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe and began to breathe. She didn't make it an exercise. She simply let her lungs expand fully, holding the air for a beat and then releasing it in a slow, audible sigh that mimicked the wind moving through the jolly screens. She waited, her gaze soft and steady, mirroring the pace she wanted Mira to find. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the distant call of a peacock and the frantic scrape of brass on wood. But slowly, the frequency of the room shifted. Mira's hand paused mid-air, hovering over a napkin. She seemed to catch the rhythm of Idika's breathing, her own chest hitching once, then twice, before it began to settle. The frantic energy didn't vanish, but it lost its jagged edge. Mira let out a long, shuddering breath and finally dropped her arms to her sides, her fingers curling into her palms. "I can't get it right," Mira whispered. She didn't look up, she stayed focused on the table, her voice stripped of its hurried quality. "No matter where I put the lamps, it feels like something is missing, or something is wrong. I keep thinking that if the table isn't perfect, the rest of the evening will just dissolve." Idika moved closer, her footsteps silent on the cool stone floor. She didn't touch the lamps. She didn't correct the symmetry. She simply stood beside her cousin, her presence a quiet anchor. "The house has survived a century of imperfect tables, Mira. It isn't the lamps that hold the family together." Mira leaned into Idika's shoulder, a small, fragile movement. The tension in her frame didn't disappear, but it softened, like wax near a flame. "That's the problem," Mira said, her voice barely audible. "I'm the one who makes sure the lamps are straight. I'm the one who remembers who likes their tea with more sugar, and who hates the smell of night bloom scent. I spend all my time organizing the edges of everyone else's lives. I'm terrified that if I stop for 1 second, they'll realize I'm just the organizer. That I'm not actually a daughter of this house, but just the person who keeps the house running." Idika tilted her head, listening to the silence that followed. She thought of the purple veins on the ancient tree in the garden, the hidden pathology beneath a hardy exterior. She felt a sudden kinship with Mira's invisible burden. The beauty of the gathering isn't in the placement of the brass, Mira. It's in the friction of the people. The arguments over old stories, the way the laughter fills the gaps where the symmetry fails. If everything were perfect, there would be no room for us to actually fit in. Idika's voice was a slow, melodic cadence, a gentle counterpoint to the chaotic energy that had filled the room moments before. She watched as Mira finally let go of her dupatta, her hands relaxing at her sides. A small, tentative smile touched Mira's lips, a flicker of genuine peace that seemed to light up her tired eyes. For a moment, the room felt still, the air thick with a shared vulnerability that was more grounding than any ritual of organization. Mira sighed, a sound of surrender. You always did have a way of making the world feel smaller, Idika, less like a mountain to climb and more like a garden to walk through. Just as the silence began to feel permanent, a sharp, metal-sharp clang echoed from the direction of the kitchen, followed by the distinct sound of a heady pot being slammed onto a granite counter. The sound ripped through the stillness like a blade. Both women jumped, the suddenness of the noise bringing the tension back into the room instantly. "This is unacceptable," a voice boomed, low and steady, yet carrying an authority that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was a voice that didn't need to shout to be heard, it simply occupied all the available space. "Who has moved the mortar and pestle from the north corner? And why, in the name of everything sacred, is there a scent of store-bought incense drifting into my kitchen?" Mira froze, her eyes widening. The peace she had found vanished, replaced by a familiar, wide-eyed apprehension. She instinctively reached for her dupatta, smoothing it with a sudden, jerky motion. "Aunt Dipti," she whispered, the name sounding like a warning. Idika felt a prickle of anticipation. She had heard of Dipti Shekhawat's rigidity, the woman who treated a recipe like a sacred text and a kitchen like a sanctuary. The arrival of the eldest aunt didn't just signal the start of the reunion, it signaled the arrival of a different kind of order, one that didn't care about the symmetry of lamps, but demanded a precision of tradition that Idika suspected would clash violently with her own scientific instincts. As the rhythmic sound of Dipti's footsteps approached the dining hall, measured, slow, and uncompromising, Idika looked back at the table. The lamps were still slightly crooked, the napkins were still slumping, and the air was still heavy with the threat of rain. It was a beautiful, imperfect mess, and as the shadow of Aunt Dipti fell across the threshold, Idika realized the real challenge of the homecoming had only just begun. The scent of riddles. The scent hit Idika before the footsteps did. A thick, pungent aroma of damp earth and crushed cloves, laced with something metal sharp, like a metal tang coin resting on a wet tongue. It was a smell that didn't just drift, it occupied the hallway, pushing aside the lingering tension of Aunt Dipti's arrival. Lopa Jodhpuriya descended the stairs with a slow, rhythmic grace, her cotton sari whispering against the stone steps. In her weathered hands, she cradled a small, unglazed clay pot. The plant inside was a chaotic tangle of silver-gray foliage and deep, bruised purple stems, its leaves narrow and serrated like miniature saws. Idika stepped forward, her academic instincts snapping into place. She didn't see a plant so much as a puzzle of morphology. She leaned in, her nose inches from the foliage, tilting her head to observe the phyllotaxy. Is this a variant of Plectranthus? Or perhaps a localized mutation of a mint hybrid? Idika's voice was precise, the syllables clipped and clean. The leaf structure suggests a high adaptation for moisture retention, and the scent profile has a distinct cineole quality, though the base note is far more organic, almost fungal. Where did you source this? I haven't seen this specific phenotype in the regional records. Lopa stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes twinkling behind thin-rimmed glasses. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she held the pot slightly higher, as if offering the plant to the air. You are counting the teeth of the saw, Idika, but you have forgotten to ask why the wood is being cut, Lopa said, her voice light and wispy, carrying the cadence of a lullaby. She smiled, a slow unfolding of wrinkles. This is the flower that blooms only for those who forget the hour. It does not care for records, and it certainly does not care for names. Idika blinked, her brow furrowing. The ambiguity felt like a physical obstruction in the room. I don't understand. Are you referring to a circadian rhythm? Some plants only open their stomata or bloom during precise lunar phases or temperature drops. If you can tell me the genus, I can look up the triggers. She shifted her weight, her fingers itching to reach for a notebook. The need for a concrete label was a hunger, a way to anchor herself in a house that felt increasingly like it was made of smoke and memory. Lopa let out a soft, melodic hum and began to walk, not toward the kitchen where Dipti's authority still simmered, but toward a shaded corner of the haveli. The corridor opened into a small, recessed alcove where the blue paint of the walls had peeled in long, elegant strips, revealing the pale limestone beneath. The air here was cooler, smelling of ancient dust and the ghost of night bloom scent. Lopa placed the clay pot on a low stone ledge and stepped back, crossing her arms loosely over her chest. "Close your eyes," Lopa commanded gently. "Now, describe the scent to me. But you must leave your university at the door. No Latin, no chemistry, no profiles. Tell me what the smell is, not what it consists of." Idika hesitated. Her mind immediately began to categorize. Terpenes, esters, volatile organic compounds. She felt a surge of restlessness, a phantom itch to analyze the air. She closed her eyes, but her internal monologue remained a ledger of facts. She breathed in deeply, and for a moment she felt the familiar friction of her own rigidity. She tried to describe it as earthy or sharp, but those were just placeholders for scientific terms. She felt the urge to argue, to explain that sensory data is subjective and therefore imprecise, but Lopa's presence was a quiet weight that demanded a different kind of honesty. She stood in the silence, the sounds of the haveli filtering in, the distant rhythmic scrape of Dipti's cloth against the granite counter, the faint chirp of a sparrow in the eaves. Idika let the scent wash over her again. She stopped trying to dissect it and instead let it pull her backward. Suddenly, she wasn't in the alcove. She was 6 years old, standing on the porch of the haveli during the first storm of the decade. She remembered the shock of the first heavy drop hitting the scorched, white-hot stone of the courtyard, the sudden, violent release of steam and minerals. "It smells like a memory of rain on a hot stone," Idika whispered. Her voice had lost its academic quip. It sounded smaller, more vulnerable. She felt a strange looseness in her chest, as if a knot she hadn't known she was tying had suddenly slipped. Lopa's smile widened, though she remained still. "There," she said softly. "You are finally beginning to breathe in sync with the house, Idika, rather than fighting against it. You have spent so long measuring the wind that you forgot how to feel the breeze on your skin." Idika opened her eyes and looked at the purple stems. The plant no longer looked like a specimen to be classified. It looked alive in a way that felt almost predatory in its intensity. She felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the bruising on the roots she had seen earlier in the garden with Omkar. The world was shifting from a series of data points into a living, breathing entity that didn't want to be solved. "This herb," Lopa continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, "is the secret heart of the family's winter tonic. It provides the depth that separates a meal from a memory. But be warned, Idika, the plant is temperamental. It is a key that only turns in the lock if the cook has emptied their mind first. If you approach the pot with a head full of numbers and a heart full of deadlines, the scent will turn bitter in the pan, and the medicine will become a poison." Idika looked from the plant to Lopa. The warning felt less like a culinary tip and more like a riddle about her own life. She thought of the centrifuge and the sterile labs of her previous years, the way she had tried to force the desert flora to bloom on her own schedule. She wondered if she had been poisoning her own experience by trying to quantify it. As Lopa turned to lead her back toward the main hall, Idika lingered for a second, glancing back at the purple leaves. A sudden, sharp draft swept through the alcove, extinguishing a small oil lamp nearby with a sudden pop. In the flickering dimness, Idika noticed something she had missed before. Tucked into the soil of the clay pot, partially buried beneath the silver leaves, was a small, rusted iron key, its bow shaped like a coiled serpent. It hadn't been there a moment ago, or perhaps she had simply been too busy classifying the leaves to see it. She reached out to touch it, but the sound of Aunt Dipti's voice, now sharp and demanding, echoed from the kitchen, pulling her back into the world of rigid orders and ancestral debts. The weight of brass. Dipti Shakawat was wiping the granite counter in rhythmic, concentric circles, her wrist moving with the precision of a clockwork gear. The cloth was a scrap of old cotton, grayed by years of use but scrubbed clean, and she applied a pressure that suggested she wasn't merely removing dust, but erasing the very memory of it. She did not look up when Idika entered the kitchen, though the shift in the room's air, the scent of damp earth and the lingering sharp tang of the garden, announced the botanist's arrival. The kitchen smelled of toasted cumin and the faint, sharp ghost of vinegar, a space where every jar of pickled mango and every tin of ghee sat in a disciplined, silent row. Idika stopped a few feet from the counter, her fingers still tingling from the ghost touch of the serpent key she had left behind in the soil. The key felt like a secret humming in her pocket, a jagged contrast to the sterile order of Dipti's domain. She watched the circles of the cloth for a moment, mesmerized by the repetition, before she found her voice. "I was thinking about the Kursangri," Idika said. her voice soft and melodic, though she stepped forward with a tentative energy. "The soaking process for the dried berries takes so long. If we used a controlled temperature bath, perhaps a sous vide approach, or even just a adjusted warm soak, we could break down the tannins much faster without compromising the texture. It would save hours of waiting." The cloth stopped. The silence that followed was not an empty space, but a heavy physical thing that pressed against Idika's chest. Dipti did not move for several seconds, her hand remaining flat against the granite. When she finally looked up, her gaze was steady and devoid of sharpness, yet it carried the weight of a closed door. "The berries do not wish to be rushed, Idika," Dipti said, her low register voice vibrating in the small room. "The time they spend in the water is not a delay, it is the process. To speed it up is to tell the ingredient that its nature is an inconvenience. In this kitchen, we do not treat the food as a problem to be solved." Idika opened her mouth to argue, to speak of cellular osmosis and the chemistry of hydration, but the look in Dipti's eyes silenced her. It wasn't anger, it was a profound, immovable conviction. Dipti turned away and reached into a deep shadowed cupboard, hauling out a set of ancestral brass pots. They were massive, the metal dull and heavy, lacking the mirror polish of modern cookware, but possessing a density that seemed to anchor the entire room. As Dipti set them on the stone with a resonant, metal-sharp thud, Idika felt a strange sense of vertigo. These pots were not mere tools, they were monuments. They represented a standard of purity that defied quantification, a lineage of heat and salt that had remained unchanged for generations. Idika reached out to help, her instinct for organization kicking in. She saw the spice jars scattered on a side table, cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, and began to align them by size, moving them into a neat, logical gradient. She wanted to create a system, a visual map that would make the cooking more efficient. Before she could place the third jar, Dipti's hand clamped firmly around her wrist. The grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. Dipti didn't pull her away, she simply held her still, forcing Idika to look at the jar. "You hold the glass as if it is a specimen in a laboratory," Dipti observed, her voice steady. "You grip it with your mind, trying to categorize it. To handle the spices is to listen to them. You do not organize them for your convenience. You place them where the hand naturally falls when the heart is focused on the pot." Dipti slowly adjusted Idika's fingers, shifting the grip from a tight, precise hold to a looser, more intuitive cradle. The touch was clinical yet ancestral, a correction of posture that felt like a correction of philosophy. Idika stepped back, her breath hitching. Why is every single gesture a battle? Idika wondered, a spike of frustration blooming in her gut. "I am trying to be helpful, to apply everything I know to make this work better. But here, better is a dirty word. I feel like a child being taught to walk, as if my entire education, my years of study and degrees, are nothing more than a layer of dust that needs to be wiped away. I am looking at the world through a microscope, and she is telling me to throw the microscope away and just smell the air. But how do you trust a process that has no metrics? How do you know you're succeeding if you aren't measuring the result?" She studied the brass pots again, their dull surfaces reflecting the dim light of the kitchen. The friction between them felt like a physical current, a simmering tension that mirrored the heat of the stove. Idika realized that she was treating the recipe like a formula to be optimized, while Dipti was treating it like a prayer. For Dipti, the exact temperature of the water, the weight of the brass, and the slow, agonizing pace of the soak weren't about the flavor of the sangri. They were about the woman who had first taught her. Every rigid rule was a fence built around a memory, a way to ensure that the love of the grandmother who created the dish remained untainted by the intrusions of the modern world. Idika's shoulders dropped. The rigidity she had felt from Dipti suddenly looked less like coldness and more like a fierce protective guardianship. The kitchen wasn't a lab, it was a shrine. Dipti observed the shift in Idika's posture, the slight tilt of her head as she contemplated the pots. The aunt's expression remained a mask of authority, but the intensity of her gaze softened by a fraction. She reached for a heavy brass ladle, its handle worn smooth by a century of palms, and held it out toward Idika. The weight of the object was surprising, pulling Idika's arm down as she took it. "You may help me," Dipti said, her voice remaining low and steady. "But there is a condition. You will follow my directions exactly. You will not suggest an improvement. You will not calculate the timing. You will not attempt to optimize the flame. You will simply be the hands that carry out the will of the recipe." Idika looked at the ladle, then at Dipti. The challenge was clear. To survive in this kitchen, she had to surrender her intellect to her intuition. She felt the cold weight of the serpent key in her pocket, a reminder of the mysteries waiting for her outside the kitchen walls. but for now, the most daunting mystery was the one sitting in the brass pot. "I can do that," Idika whispered, though her mind was already racing, wondering if the brass's thermal conductivity would actually affect the distribution of heat in the oil. Dipti noticed the flicker of analysis in Idika's eyes and narrowed hers. "Do not think, Idika, just stir." As Idika dipped the ladle into the pot, she felt the resistance of the ingredients, the slow swirl of the thick sauce. But as she stirred, a scent rose from the pot that she couldn't classify, a deep, earthy musk that smelled of rain on hot stone and old libraries. It was a scent that didn't belong in a cookbook. Just as she began to settle into the rhythm, a sudden, sharp clatter echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of something heavy sliding across the floor, cutting through the meditative silence of the kitchen. The clicking of beans. The brass ladle remained frozen in the pot, a single golden drop of oil clinging to its lip, as the echo of the crash died away in the hallway. Idika didn't move. The sound had been surgical, the shriek of metal on stone followed by a heavy, sliding thud that felt like a physical blow to the silence. Dipti's hand remained poised in the air, her fingers still curled in a gesture of command, but her eyes had shifted toward the doorway. For a moment, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hiss of the stove, a steady white noise that seemed to mock the sudden violence of the interruption. "Stay here," Dipti said. Her voice hadn't risen in pitch, but it had gained a new, sharp edge, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. She stepped away from the stove with a precision that bordered on the military, her gaze scanning the floor for any sign of intrusion. Idika felt the sudden urge to follow, her fingers twitching against the handle of the ladle. She wanted to know what had fallen, to categorize the sound. Was it a vase? A piece of furniture? The logical part of her brain, the part that lived in spreadsheets and taxonomies, was already calculating the trajectory of the noise. But Dipti's command was absolute. Idika stood still, her heart performing a slow, heavy roll in her chest. As she waited, her gaze drifted to the corner of the kitchen where a stack of terracotta bowls sat, their edges chipped and dusty, smelling of old earth and dormant seeds. Beside them lay a bundle of dried herbs, tied with a fraying piece of jute twine that looked as though it might snap under the weight of a single breath. When Dipti returned a minute later, her expression was unreadable, though there was a slight tightness at the corners of her mouth. "A stray dog has knocked over a decorative screen in the corridor," she announced, though she didn't look at Idika. "And it seems the commotion has startled the rest of the house. Mira is coming to assist us. The sundry cannot wait, but the sorting must be finished before the soak begins." Mira entered the kitchen a moment later, her presence like a soft breeze after a storm. She was smoothing her dupatta with a habitual, rhythmic motion, her eyes wide and slightly glazed with a lingering anxiety. "I heard the noise from the upper gallery," Mira said, her voice breathy, ending with a soft, questioning hum. "Is everyone all right? I thought perhaps a shelf had finally given way." "The house is merely breathing, Mira," Dipti replied, though she didn't offer a smile. She pointed to a large ceramic basin on the central wooden table, filled to the brim with dried curberries. They looked like tiny, shriveled peppercorns, a deep, dusty ochre that seemed to absorb the light of the room. "Sit, sort. We cannot have a single stone or a withered berry spoiling the batch." Idika took her place beside Mira. The task was deceptively simple. Move the berries from the large basin into smaller bowls, discarding any that were cracked, discolored, or accompanied by grit. At first, Idika approached it as a problem of efficiency. She watched the way the berries tumbled, the way they bounced off the ceramic with a sharp, metal-sharp click. Her internal clock began to tick. If she utilized a tiered sieve, she calculated, she could reduce the sorting time by 70%. She could categorize the berries by diameter and density in a fraction of the time it took to move them one by hand. "It's so slow," Idika whispered, more to herself than to the others. She felt a restlessness in her wrists, a phantom itch to optimize the process. She began to move her hands faster, trying to turn the sorting into a race, her fingers blurring as she flicked the berries into the bowl. The sound shifted from a rhythmic click to a frantic chatter, a staccato noise that felt dissonant against the heavy, slow energy of the kitchen. Mira, however, was doing the opposite. She moved with a deliberate, almost liturgical slowness. Her fingers dipped into the basin, lifting a handful of berries and letting them slide through her palm like sand. Each berry that hit the ceramic bowl produced a clean, resonant pink sheen. As she worked, the tension in Mira's shoulders began to dissolve. The frantic smoothing of her dupatta ceased. Her hands stayed in the basin, submerged in the dry, earthy scent of the care. She wasn't just sorting. She was grounding herself, using the repetition to quiet the echo of the crash in the hallway. Dipti stood over them, her arms crossed. She didn't speak, but her gaze shifted between the two women. She watched Idika's frantic pace with a flicker of disapproval, but when her eyes landed on Mira, there was a momentary softening, a ghost of a smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. To Dipti, the sorting wasn't a chore to be completed, it was a filter for the mind. The berries were the medium through which the noise of the world was strained out, leaving only the essence of the task. Idika felt the heat of Dipti's observation and slowly decelerated. She forced her fingers to mimic Mira's pace. As the speed dropped, the sound changed. The frantic chatter evolved into a percussion piece, a steady, hypnotic click-clack-clack-clack. It was a binary rhythm, a heartbeat of the house. Idika closed her eyes for a second, letting the sound wash over her. She stopped thinking about sieves and centrifugal force and started listening to the music of the beans. The sound was ancient. It was the sound of 1,000 women in 1,000 kitchens, doing the exact same thing for 1,000 years. As the berries began to soak in the warm water, a scent rose from the basins that hit Idika with the force of a physical memory. It was a deep, musk-heavy aroma, smelling of rain-drenched limestone and the powdery scent of her grandmother's cotton sari. It was a smell that didn't belong in a laboratory. It was a scent of safety, of laps that served as pillows and stories that stretched into the midnight hours. Idika felt a sudden, sharp ache in her throat. She realized she had spent the last decade treating the world as a series of specimens to be analyzed, forgetting that some things are meant to be felt, not categorized. She reached out and touched a soaking berry, feeling the rough, wrinkled skin yield under her fingertip as it absorbed the water. The texture was paradoxical, simultaneously coarse and fragile. For the first time since she had returned to Jodhpur, Idika didn't wonder about the osmotic pressure driving the water into the cell walls of the plant. She simply felt the coolness of the water and the grit of the berry, letting the sensation anchor her to the wooden table and the women beside her. "You are finally here," Dipti said softly. It was the first time the aunt had spoken in 10 minutes, and the tone was devoid of its usual authority. It was almost a welcome. Mira hummed in agreement, a small, contented sound. For a moment, the kitchen was a sanctuary of shared rhythm, the three women bound together by the clicking of beans and the scent of the earth. The tension that had defined their interaction since Idika's arrival seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a meditative stillness that felt like a held breath. That breath was shattered by a sound that eclipsed the earlier crash. From the courtyard, a violent, explosive splintering echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy terracotta shattering into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't the accidental tumble of a dog or a sliding screen, it was the sound of something large and structural giving way. Idika jumped, the basin of soaking berries sloshing over the rim and spilling cold water across her lap. The warmth of the moment vanished instantly. As the three of them turned toward the courtyard, the scent of the rain-drenched earth was suddenly overtaken by something sharp and metal-sharp, a smell like static crackle and old iron, drifting in through the open window. The distant rumble. The sharp tang still clung to the back of Idika's throat as they stepped out into the courtyard, the scent of static crackle fighting with the heavy, spice-laden air. In the center of the space, the brass pots were already simmering, the kheer sangri releasing a rich, earthy aroma of dried berries and toasted cumin that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a fragile curtain drawn against the chaos. The structural collapse had left a jagged wound in the stone tiling, a heap of terracotta shards and splintered wood that looked like a skeletal remain against the blue wash of the walls. The sharp, iron-like smell lingered around the debris, an alien intruder in a house that usually smelled of sandalwood and old paper. Mira was already moving, her hands fluttering like trapped birds as she studied the seating arrangement. The low wooden stools were scattered in a haphazard semicircle, one tilted precariously on a loose stone, another pushed too far into the shadow of the archway. She began to shift them, her breath coming in short, shallow hitches. She adjusted a cushion by a fraction of an inch, then pulled it back, her brow furrowed in a concentrated effort to impose order on a day that had already surrendered to the unpredictable. She didn't speak, but the rhythmic, frantic smoothing of her dupatta told the story of a mind trying to organize its way out of anxiety. Idika watched her, noting the way Mira's knuckles were white against the fabric. The botanist stepped forward and gently closed her fingers over Mira's wrist. The contact was light, but it was enough to break the cycle of movement. Mira froze, her eyes wide and shimmering with a restlessness she couldn't name. Idika didn't pull her away, she simply held the wrist, feeling the rapid, thrumming pulse beneath the skin, a tiny bird beating its wings against a cage. "Let it be askew," Idika said, her voice melodic and slow, a deliberate contrast to Mira's kinetic energy. "The house is breathing, Mira. The chairs don't need to be perfect for the rain to find us. There is a kind of grace in the way things break and settle where they may." Mira looked at the shattered terracotta in the center of the courtyard, and then back at Idika. A small, tentative hum escaped her throat, not the contented sound from the kitchen, but a questioning one. She slowly relaxed her grip on the cushion, her shoulders dropping an inch. She didn't quite smile, but the frantic energy dimmed, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the imperfection. She folded her hands neatly in her lap as she sat on the nearest stool, though she still glanced occasionally at the crooked alignment of the others. Around them, the rest of the family gathered in a collective, breathless anticipation. Tipti stood by the brass pots, her expression unreadable, though she meticulously wiped the rim of a serving bowl in slow, rhythmic circles. Amkar leaned against the blue wall, his hands deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. No one spoke. The silence wasn't the meditative peace they had found among the berries. It was an oppressive, heavy stillness, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide or a confession. The air felt thick, almost viscous, as if the humidity had turned the atmosphere into a liquid they were all swimming through. Idika tilted her head, listening. The absence of sound was more jarring than the crash had been. The house sparrows, usually a chaotic choir in the eaves, had vanished. The wind, which had been teasing the edges of the courtyard for hours, had died completely. It was a vacuum of sound, a sensory void that made the blood rushing in her ears sound like a distant river. She felt a strange pressure in her sinuses, the atmospheric weight of a sky that had become a bruised, swollen purple, pressing down on the golden sandstone of Jodhpur. They stood there, a small cluster of humans anchored to a crumbling courtyard, watching the horizon. The purple of the sky was deepening, veining into charcoal and indigo, swallowing the distant outlines of the city's forts. The scent of the simmering Kher Sangri drifted through the air, a warm, savory tether to the physical world, while the metal-sharp scent of the collapse remained as a cold reminder of the unknown. Idika felt a prickle of heat on the back of her neck, not from the sun, but from the sheer tension of the weight. Then it happened. It wasn't a sound at first, but a vibration. A low, guttural rumble started deep in the earth, traveling up through the soles of Idika's feet, vibrating to her ankles, and settling in the hollow of her chest. It was a frequency more than a noise, a subterranean growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the haveli. Mira gasped, her hand flying to her throat, and even Dipti stopped her rhythmic wiping, her hand pausing mid-circle on the brass. Idika closed her eyes for a second, zooming in on the sensation. She could feel the vibration echoing in her teeth, a resonant hum that mirrored the low frequency of a distant engine. It was the sound of the atmosphere collapsing under its own weight, the herald of a monsoon that had been delayed too long. The rumble grew, evolving into a deep, rolling thunder that sounded like boulders being ground together in a giant mill, echoing across the Thar desert and bouncing off the limestone cliffs. Just as the excitement reached a fever pitch, a sudden violent shift occurred in the light. A rift opened in the charcoal clouds, and a shaft of blinding golden sunlight pierced through, striking the courtyard with an almost aggressive brilliance. The purple hue vanished instantly, replaced by a searing yellow that made everyone squint. The heat returned in a sudden flash, the air shimmering with a renewed dryness that threatened to evaporate the rain before it could touch the soil. "No," Mira whispered, her voice a fragile thread. The hope that had been building, the desire for the rain to wash away the tension and the scent of iron, dipped sharply. They stood in the sudden glare, feeling cheated by the sun, the atmosphere shifting from heavy anticipation to a hollow, shimmering disappointment. Omkar, who had remained a silent sentinel against the wall, suddenly straightened. He didn't look at the sun, he looked past it, his eyes narrowing. He stepped forward, his rough voice cutting through the sudden brightness. "Look," he said, pointing a weathered finger toward the western edge of the horizon. Idika followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The golden light was a lie. Just beyond the rift of sunshine, a massive, monolithic wall of gray was surging forward. It wasn't a gradual approach. It was a tidal wave of cloud and rain, a slate-colored curtain that was rapidly swallowing the golden light and the distant city. The wall moved with impredatory speed, erasing the horizon line, turning the world from gold to gray in a matter of seconds. The air suddenly turned ice-cold, a freezing vanguard that swept through the courtyard, extinguishing the heat and bringing with it the scent of wet stone and ancient dust. The rain hadn't fallen yet, but the storm had already arrived. The deepening blue. The first drop didn't fall so much as it detonated. It hit a patch of scorched gray dust near the edge of the courtyard with a sharp, audible hiss, kicking up a tiny plume of steam. Then came another, and another, fat and heavy, striking the limestone tiles like rhythmic percussion. Within seconds, the air was hijacked by rain smell, not the sanitized laboratory scent Idika had studied in textbooks, but a violent, intoxicating wave of static crackle and ancient minerals that felt thick enough to swallow. It was the smell of 1,000 years of thirst finally being quenched, a raw, earthy musk that bypassed the intellect and hit the center of the chest. Idika didn't retreat toward the shelter of the verandas. Instead, she stepped forward, her sandals clicking against the stone until she reached the center of the open space. The rain descended in a sudden, blinding sheet, turning the world into a blur of slate and sapphire. She felt the water collide with her skin, cold and shocking, soaking through the cotton of her kurta until the fabric clung to her shoulders like a second skin. For years, she had approached nature as a curator, observing the world through the lens of a microscope or the distance of a field journal. Now, she let the journal stay inside. She stood with her arms hanging loose, her palms open, abandoning the scientific distance that had acted as her armor. The water washed away the lingering grit of the thaw, and for the first time since her return, the tension in her jaw simply dissolved. Around her, the haveli began to transform. The walls, washed in the traditional Jodhpur blue, reacted to the deluge with a visceral intensity. As the porous lime plaster absorbed the moisture, the color shifted in real time. The pale, sun-bleached sky blue deepened, darkening into a rich, royal indigo that seemed to pulse against the gray sky. It was as if the house were waking up, the blue bleeding deeper into the stone, reclaiming a saturation that the summer heat had stolen. Idika watched a single rivulet of water carve a path down the wall, leaving a trail of deep navy that looked like a vein of ink on a watercolor painting. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a living thing, breathing in the rain. Omkar was there, standing a few feet away. He hadn't moved to seek cover. He stood with his weathered face tilted toward the clouds, his eyes closed, the deep creases of his skin filling with rainwater. He looked less like a gardener and more like a devotee in the middle of a rite. He didn't speak, Omkar rarely did when the environment spoke for him, but as he opened his eyes and caught Idika's gaze, a look of shared triumph passed between them. It was a silent acknowledgement of a pact made with the earth. He gave a single, slow nod, his rough presence a grounding force amidst the chaos of the downpour. In that look, Idika felt the invisible barrier between the academic visitor and the ancestral keeper finally crumble. Her attention shifted to the dormant buds she had spent the last week obsessing over, the ones she had tried to coax into life with precise nutrient ratios and measured hydration. In the wake of the deluge, the plants were responding with a sudden, desperate urgency. She knelt in the mud, ignoring the stain on her clothes, to watch a cluster of desert blooms. The buds, which had remained tight and stubborn under her scientific care, were swelling. Right there, in the span of a few minutes, the pressure of the rain seemed to trigger a mechanical release. The petals unfurled with a slow, liquid grace, peeling back to reveal centers of vivid gold and crimson. They weren't just growing, they were erupting. The urgency of the bloom was a lesson in timing. The desert didn't want precision, it wanted a flood. Idika felt a profound sense of arrival settle in her marrow. For the first time, the haveli didn't feel like a sight she was documenting or a puzzle she was solving. The dampness of the earth seeping into her skin and the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof anchored her. She was no longer the botanist observing an ecosystem. She was a biological component of it, subject to the same whims of wind and water as the indigo walls and the erupting flowers. The academic rigidity that had defined her life in the labs felt like a garment that had grown too small, and she was glad to be rid of it. From the direction of the kitchen, a new scent began to weave through the rain smell. It was the heavy, savory aroma of simmering kersangri, the dried desert beans and berries being slow-cooked in mustard oil and spices. The smell of the rain, metal-sharp and fresh, collided with the warm, nutty scent of the traditional dish, creating a sensory anchor that pinned her firmly to the present. It was the scent of survival and celebration, the smell of a family that had learned how to turn the scarcity of the desert into a feast. The duality of the scents, the wild, raw outdoors and the curated, loving indoors, felt like the two halves of her own identity finally clicking into place. As the rain shifted from a deluge to a steady, rhythmic hum, Idika stood up and wiped the mud from her knees. She wandered toward the garden gate, where the water was cascading off the eaves in thick, translucent curtains. As she reached for the latch, she noticed something wedged into the weathered wood of the gatepost. It was a small, square piece of parchment, yellowed with age and miraculously preserved within a protective wax coating. She pulled it free, her fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting was unmistakable, the elegant, looping script of her grandmother, a hand that had once guided her own first attempts at drawing leaves. The ink had faded to a soft sepia, but the words were clear. "For the one who listens to the rain," the note began. "The blue of these walls holds more than just color. There is a secret tucked within the indigo, waiting for the season when the earth remembers how to breathe." Idika looked up at the deep, royal indigo of the walls surrounding her. The rain was still falling, but the atmosphere had changed. The meditative peace remained, yet it was now laced with a thin thread of mystery. She traced the line of the wall with her eyes, noticing for the first time a slight irregularity in the plaster near the base of the eastern wing. A faint, geometric indentation that she had previously dismissed as a structural flaw. The house was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a map, and the rain had just provided the key. A steam of belonging. The heavy brass bowls arrived at the table with a rhythmic, metal-sharp clatter that echoed against the indigo walls. The rain had retreated to a steady, low-frequency hum, leaving the courtyard air thick with a dampness that made the skin feel cool and porous. In the center of the wooden table, the kher sangri simmered, its surface a glossy, deep ochre, releasing plumes of steam that curled upward like incense. The scent was a concentrated essence of the thar, bitter, nutty, and deeply rooted in the salt of the earth. Dipti Shekawat moved with a precision that bordered on the liturgical. She placed the bowls with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes scanning the arrangement to ensure the symmetry was exact. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she performed her ritual of wiping the edge of the table in small, rhythmic circles with the white cloth, a gesture that seemed to anchor the entire family to the spot. Idika watched her aunt's hands, noting how the skin was mapped with fine lines, like the veins of the very leaves she had spent her life cataloging. The tension from the morning's scientific frictions still lingered in the air, a thin veil of academic pride clashing with ancestral tradition, but the smell of the mustard oil was beginning to dissolve it. "The heat is correct," Dipti said, her voice a low, steady register that carried the weight of an undisputed decree. She fixed on Idika, her gaze neutral but observant. "But the desert has changed since the last time this house was full. The berries are sharper this year." Idika felt the weight of the moment. Beside her, Lopa Jodhpuriya reached into the folds of her cotton shawl and produced a small bundle of fresh herbs, wild coriander and a few sprigs of something pungent and citrusy that Idika recognized as a local variant of desert mint. Lopa didn't offer them directly, she simply placed them on the table, her eyes closing for a second as she inhaled the scent, her expression one of distant, melodic memory. "The old ways are the foundation," Lopa whispered, her voice light and rhythmic, "but a house must breathe with the wind that blows today." Idika hesitated, her fingertips brushing the rough grain of the wooden table. She watched Dipti, whose jaw remained set, the guardian of the recipe's purity. Idika reached for the herbs, her movements slow and precise. She didn't simply toss them into the pot, she took a single leaf of the mint, bruised it gently between her thumb and forefinger to release the volatile oils, and let it drift onto the surface of the kher sangri. It was a small, daring intervention, a botanist's touch added to a matriarch's legacy. Dipti watched the leaf settle. For a long heartbeat, the only sound was the distant drip of water from the eaves. Then, with a slow, singular nod, Dipti stepped back. It wasn't a verbal surrender, but it was an acceptance. By allowing the garnish, Dipti was acknowledging that the recipe, like the family, was a living thing, capable of evolution without losing its soul. Mira Rathor let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since Idika first stepped off the train. She didn't smooth her dupatta, she didn't adjust her posture. She simply leaned back in her chair, a genuine, unhurried smile softening the lines of her face. "It smells like the house is waking up," Mira murmured, her voice ending in a comforting hum that vibrated in the quiet space between them. Idika took her first bite. The world narrowed down to a single point of sensory convergence. First came the sharp, saline punch of the dried berries, followed immediately by the earthy, grounding depth of the sangrai beans. Then the heat of the mustard oil bloomed across her palate, a slow burn warmth that felt like a physical embrace. The final note was the bright, citrusy snap of the bruised mint, cutting through the richness like a flash of light in a dark room. It was more than a flavor, it was a psychological sedative. The rigid partitions in Idika's mind, the divide between the lab and the home, the PhD and the granddaughter collapsed. The taste was a bridge, pulling her out of her head and firmly into her body. "I spent so long trying to measure the rain," Idika said, her voice melodic and measured, the cadence slowing down to match the rhythm of the courtyard. She studied Omkar, who was leaning against the indigo wall, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the scene with a quiet, pebble-like contentment. "I thought if I could quantify the nutrients in the soil or the timing of the bloom, I would understand the garden, but I was just counting the seconds instead of living them." Omkar let out a low, rough chuckle. "The desert doesn't keep a clock, Idika. It only keeps a memory." As the meal progressed, the conversation shifted. It no longer revolved around the logistics of the haveli or the science of the flora. Instead, they began to speak of the grandmother. They spoke of her laughter, which Mira described as sounding like silver bells in a windstorm, and her stubbornness, which Dipti recalled as a form of quiet architecture. They shared stories of how she would talk to the plants as if they were unruly children, and how she could predict a storm by the way the dust settled on the windowsills. Idika listened, her head tilted slightly, absorbing the narratives as if they were rare specimens. She realized that her identity was not a collection of credentials or a list of publications. It wasn't something she had earned in a laboratory in a distant city. It was here, etched into the deep blue of the walls, tasted in the salt of the Kersangri, and felt in the cool, damp stone beneath her feet. She was a piece of a larger, slower machinery, a link in a chain of women who had known how to survive the scarcity of the sand by cultivating the richness of the heart. Mira reached over and touched Idika's wrist, a brief, warm pressure. "You're not a visitor anymore," Mira whispered. Idika didn't answer with words. She simply closed her eyes. The rain had settled into a soft, translucent drizzle, a mist that blurred the edges of the courtyard. In the silence that followed, Idika found that the quiet was no longer an empty space to be filled with analysis or anxiety. It was a full silence, heavy with the presence of those who had come before her and the steady, pulsing heartbeat of the house. She sat there for a long time, breathing in the scent of brass and damp earth, finally understanding that the greatest discovery she could make in this garden was the art of staying still. As the light faded into a bruised purple twilight, Idika's mind drifted back to the geometric indentation in the eastern wing. The peace was absolute, but beneath it, the small, wax-coated note remained a humming wire of curiosity. She knew the secret was still there, tucked within the indigo, waiting. But for the first time, she wasn't in a rush to solve it. The mystery could wait for the morning. For now, the warmth of the meal and the company of her kin were the only truths that mattered.